Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, welcome back. It's the Karma Koala podcast. And on this episode, I came across Mattha Busby, I think, as always, via LinkedIn, and saw that he's been writing about psychedelic issues, legal, and also sort of social and those sorts of things. So I thought I'd just get him on the podcast and we'd have a chat about what he's doing, why he's doing it, and take it from there. It's a fairly open conversation, mate. I did, especially with the psychedelics ones. You never know where they're going to go. So let's just dive in. I think the first thing is we just discussed in the preamble. You'd been writing for The Guardian. You did a few psychedelic pieces for them, I think, and then some other media. What brought you to that? Were you given the job, or was it something that you pitched at people?
Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me on, Sean. Really happy to have this conversation on this very auspicious day. It's still New Year's Day. Well, it's still New Year's Day here in Vancouver, although my brother is in Melbourne, so it's a bit tricky for my poor mother, me being 8 hours behind and her other son being 9 hours ahead or even more, perhaps.
Oh no! Well, my mother's so used to it now. She just she wakes up and just WhatsApps Happy New Year, and she doesn't really care where any of her grandchildren, children, nieces, and nephews are on the planet. And they just have to accept it's New Year's morning with her. She's never celebrated New Year's Eve. I think since about 1963, I think.
Well, you mentioned the nature of this conversation is going to be very sort of open and free flowing. So. Yeah. Perhaps my mum needs to do a bit more psychedelics and, surrender control of needing to know, the date and time of where her sons are being.
Oh, yeah, but I don't know the age of your mother, but if she's anything like mine, that's not going to be happening. Although I hasten to add, after years knowing that I smoke weed, when my stepfather was dying the year before last, she actually eventually quizzed me on whether that would be a good thing for him as he was in his final months. And I suggested actually no, it probably wouldn't. He was an anaesthetist, so but I said no, he would have had to start a little bit earlier. I'm not going to feed him anything with THC as he was pretty confused in his latter days. So yes, yeah. Getting that generation in the UK to sort of understand these things a bit more. I was growing a little bit in the greenhouse next to the bus stop behind a hedge, and she was just constantly worried that somebody at the bus stop was going to peek through the hedge and see this evil plant in the greenhouse. But she's getting older and slightly more relaxed towards these things, if not accepting.
Well, I think that's a very understandable concern. I only did a podcast for the BBC recently talking about this gentleman, Gary Youds, in fact, is a Scouse pronunciation of his surname. And, his grow got busted and, he got fucked for it recently. So, your mother's concern.
I'm joking, but I'm totally serious at the same time. My tech guy who I work with in Queensland, which is a dreadful place, his son was growing underneath the deck at the back of the building where nobody could see it, and still somebody in this day and age dobbed him in for 3 plants, and he ended up in court. So yeah, these people forget about all these issues, especially in the US and in Canada, because it's very real for everybody else on the planet. Look, I live in Indonesia, so you don't even think about involving yourself in that sort of conversation. That's just not going to happen.
Well, I don't know if you saw that one of my recent other pieces for The Guardian concerned this basketball player, Jared Shaw.
Yeah, well, I'm fully aware of Jared. I actually just wrote the rest of that up yesterday. although I have a slightly different take on that because some of the Americans are very naive about going overseas.
Well, clearly, I mean, he did resist the temptation for 3 years, he says, in terms of importing cannabis gummies. But I think that he got a little bit carried away after being named in the kind of basketball all-star team. So one of the best sort of half a dozen odd players in the country. And he seemed to think, especially after spending a lot of time in Thailand, which sort of obviously sort of legalized it, but then slightly backtracked, but still is a kind of relative utopia in the region for stoners. That obviously bred a certain naivety. And for listeners
Well,
that are unaware
I
of
would
his
suggest
case,
with
he
North
got
America,
caught and then was facing the death penalty.
yeah.
But now his sentence has been reduced to sort of around 3 years with time served. So hopefully he'll be out, within a number of months, but he
He'll
could
be
be
out.
still
He'll
inside
be
for
out.
another couple of years.
He'll be out within the next 9, 12 months. If I follow the Indonesian legal system very closely, and actually, there's obviously been some discussions, in various departments of central government that really they can't keep putting all these people away. So most of them, there's quite a lot of Brits who have recently been arrested in Bali for taking cocaine through. Most of them they don't want them. They send them home. They make sure they go through the court system. They make sure that they get sentenced, and then they do a deal. The lawyers do a deal with either the government, family, or whatever to get them out of the country as soon as possible. And if you follow it, this is happening with 80% of the cases because the Indonesians are smart enough to know that transnational drug smugglers are now traffickers are now using mainly Bali as a point to sell stuff because Bali has decided to try and reinvent itself as the Ibiza of Asia, and
Right.
drugs were always going to turn up. They weren't going to be able to just run that on alcohol. But
Sure.
there's
And these poor folks are the low-hanging fruit. Do you know
of
what I mean?
course,
They're
yeah,
not.
and look,
They're not the traffickers. And in fact, the traffickers are probably going to be like kind of Bangladeshis that are getting paid very little to do the bidding of actually the high up people that will never get touched. And this is obviously the kind of folly of the drug war in terms of actually kind of disrupting supply in a kind of long-standing way, because there's always another sort of willing mule.
Yep, I mean, I mean, and Indonesia is a perfect example at the moment of practicality in these matters, working within a legal system that still looks at these substances, compounds as highly dangerous narcotics. I mean, and also you have to think about it. I find the Americans very naive about this because you have to remember how many people there are in Indonesia, and the last thing they want is cocaine to be as available as meth, which is not good
Well,
for this country.
I know another chap who just imported a relatively small amount of coca leaves, and he's been in prison for a number of months now in Bali. I'm trying to get hold of him for a story. I am in touch with his sister, but I do think that they're a little bit anxious about upsetting the apple cart, whereas obviously Jared was, very keen to speak to me and had connected with the Last Prisoner Project, and was really pushing it with the advocacy. But this coca leaf gentleman, does seem a little bit more hesitant to kind of
Yes, well, I mean,
implicitly criticize the system.
that's not a smart move in certain parts of the world, should I say? I mean, and that doesn't just apply to certain parts of Southeast Asia. The same, I think, the next big issue will be China actually, and seeing what happens there, because I think that's going to be the next market for these compounds. I think it's going to be really interesting. Anyway, as I said, it's an open conversation, and we've gone completely off the topic.
And I'm very happy to. And certainly when I'm writing a follow-up story on Jared that's going to get published after the Super Bowl. So I'll be sure to get in touch, because obviously it sounds like you've got your ear closely to the ground on all of these issues. But yeah, in response to your original question, I started working sort of as a semi-staff reporter for The Guardian straight out of university, out of my master's. I was fortunate enough to get sort of free front pages, like exclusive news reports off my own back during my 2-week work experience, which I never ended up replicating over the next 4 years. Luck. They all told me that at the time, and I was like, no. Do you know what I mean? I'm on like a never-ending hot streak. But it is actually terribly difficult. Most of the time, the stories on the front page are just sort of the daily political stories. So it's kind of difficult to get something that really sort of pushes those off the front page. And so I did that for like 4 years, while freelancing a little bit on the side, but mostly Guardian stuff. Then I moved to Mexico, and sort of went fully freelance. And around that time, I'd already written a lot about cannabis. Like I covered the medical cannabis legalization campaign, lots of stories, about Billy Caldwell, and Alfie Dingley, and all of that in 2018. Like I was really, the person at the Guardian, writing those stories. And little by little, I wrote stories about psychedelics. I wrote a story for Vice about people taking LSD and communicating with trees in 2017, and that led to sort of further stories. And I did a big piece for the Observer magazine in 2021 on the emergence of psychedelics in psychiatry and MAPS's MDMA studies. So it just sort of grew over time. But in my private personal life, I was really sort of living the psychedelic renaissance. Like I'm 32. I sort of grew up as ketamine was emerging, as people started taking sort of mushroom drops in raves in London. So I've never really kind of caned it on psychedelics. But yeah, as I say, I grew up.
Yes, I come from that first generation of 89, 90, where caning it was definitely the way to go. So it's been
that's what people tell me. That people sort of older chaps like my friend Mike J. He kind of tells me that the way to take LSD used to just be sort of fuck around and find out, whereas now we're kind of pathologizing every aspect of it, and like integration and setting and all that bollocks.
Yeah, we just got a whole sheet in and then just shoved down as many as we could as quickly as we could, and then saw what happened next, basically. My Live Aid day was still a very interesting memory. That was I think 7 microdots in one day or something. It was very interesting indeed. Amount. Yeah, we really.
I need to be careful in kind of public settings, because I did a huge LSD trip at a festival a couple of years ago in the UK, and it was great for 6 hours, and then actually extremely challenging afterwards. So I really prefer, if I'm doing a big dose, I actually prefer just doing it myself. I've done sort of a lot of ceremonies, some of which for stories. And I am going actually to do an ayahuasca retreat with some UFC fighters at the end of the month in Colombia for a story for Men's Health.
I don't know what that does sound quite scary. I'm too old for that, I think.
I'm a little bit apprehensive. I honestly prefer taking psychedelics just kind of by myself, or at least like with a trusted friend, or
yes, with a bunch of muscly men who have got a lot of testosterone and a few steroids in them as well. Maybe they'll have a new outlook on life.
I wasn't interested in actually doing any ayahuasca here. Do you know what I mean? I've done it sort of 6 or 7 times before at kind of 3 or 4 different retreats. I mean, the last time was 5 years ago. I don't really love ayahuasca, to be honest. I sort of prefer mescaline-based, plants in terms of like big ceremonies. But the guy that was organizing it, he calls me up a few weeks ago, and he's just like, so are you going to do it? Like a few of the guys are asking, UFC guys are a certain kind of breed, and really put them at ease. So yeah, I'm going to have to talk to my editor about it. But yeah, the idea is that I'll certainly probably do maybe the first ceremony or 2. They're doing 4. I don't really want to do 4. I don't
No,
even.
I think that sounds
Frankly, I don't
excessive.
even. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, they're trying to cure their traumatic brain injury, and luckily, I think that I've addressed most of my traumas. Touch wood, if one can kind of say such a thing. So yeah, I'll do one
Well,
session
as a
a
man
week
of
to
a
put them
certain
at
age
ease and see what happens.
who speaks of experience, what I've discovered from this, because most of the stuff I've done in my 20s and 30s, and well, my teens, from 15 through to about 35 or something, then took basically a long break, except for the odd timers. It all kicks into action about 30 years later in terms of the way your brain operates.
Oh wow.
It's really interesting, actually. It gets more interesting as you get older, a lot more interesting. Um, I think, one of the major experiences, and we'll get back onto you, but one of the major experiences of my life, I was in Battery Park City in 9/11, extremely close to everything that happened, 1 block away, 2 blocks away. Um, and I
Right.
and I
Wow.
found that over time, that event somehow has been, I don't know, managed by my prior use of psychedelics. And as with a lot of these things, they're totally unexplainable. But it's just very interesting as time goes on. You gain more knowledge and use for it in the space between the last times you used various compounds. So it's just interesting. It's just interesting. Anyway,
Yeah. No, it's really
how
fascinating. I'm doing a story on October 7. So I've been speaking to some Israelis
Yeah,
that,
there's been a couple of stories I read
fled.
on that, which is it's I would have thought that would be the most terrifying thing whilst you were under the influence, if that's the best way. But there were a
Yeah, I
couple of
think it
articles
depends. I
saying,
think it depends what. Yeah, I think it depends what you're on. But
yeah,
this one chap I was speaking to did a huge amount of LSD, and it seems that actually it kind of helped him process his trauma, or at least not sort of attached to the trauma. To sort of be kind of, not to use too woo language, but to sort of be like an open vessel and allow it to kind of pass through him. And his hypothesis is that actually the fact that he was tripping allowed him to sort of be this kind of conduit for the entire group to actually find safety, and then to sort of integrate the experience, let's say, in real time. And obviously he's done sort of personal work since and stuff, but he's convinced that actually the LSD allowed him to sort of see the future, and actually sort of avoid going down the
a
wrong
certain path.
path.
No,
Let's
and I think
say
only
that
time will
actually
tell.
would have led to his death. Not even just a sort of mental path, but actually going further towards where this one chap, Hamas guy, was letting off sort of dozens of rounds. So really fascinating, and I'm excited to explore it all further.
No, very true. So, in terms of what you're, yeah, I speak to mainly lawyers who you know, took psychedelics, became interested in psychedelics, and then started practicing law with regard to psychedelics in the US, mainly to do with religious freedom, or sometimes they do corporate law. But of course,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but of course, that's only half the story. The conversation always ends up with actually what psychedelics is doing is, okay, I'm doing that work, but it really educates the inner self about thinking about what law is, and what a psychedelics lawyer becomes something other than a lawyer who practices in work surrounding psychedelics. And how do you leak that into the wider world of law, and maybe start talking about how law is practiced, how it's managed, and will that ever then move into the legislative system, the regulatory system, the judiciary system, which I find really, really interesting, because that's where the real conversation is. Is that how you are beginning to think about journalism as a subject, as a profession? How psychedelics informs being a journalist, and then how you operate within a a world that's basically around journalism has become something. If you don't have advertising, you don't have journalism. You don't have money, you don't have journalism. Is that where you're heading, or are you looking more towards being involved in a wider, what they love to call in the US and I presume Canada, the wider psychedelic community?
Well, it's a fascinating and discursive question. I do think that, working in law is an extremely noble and worthwhile profession, and one of the professions, perhaps more so than journalism, I dare say, that can really affect real change. A lot of people, a lot of journalists,
I believe that entirely.
Train in law, and obviously, if you get one victory, it can affect common law and set a precedent, and all the way down, so to speak, to sort of getting someone off scot-free that deserves not to be locked up. I think with regards to psychedelics, I don't think I'm on any kind of like divine mission.
I'm very glad to hear that, because too many people are on divine missions.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of lawyers are that are in the space as well, and fair enough. There's a role for everyone. I mean, I've done a huge amount of kind of critical, let's say, reporting in the psychedelic space that's definitely kind of ruffled some feathers and probably led to questions about my devotion to the cause.
Well, I'm very glad you say that, because I think that psychedelics should inform that, not negate it.
Yeah, I mean, I was on this retreat, it's more like a clinic, like an Ibogaine clinic, in 2022, and did it myself, sort of framed around the growing interest around Ibogaine, its use as sort of anti-addiction medicine, and it really can, I saw with my own eyes, reverse or eradicate, temporarily stop opioid withdrawal symptoms. Even people that have been addicted for years, and sort of get nosebleeds or sort of runny noses, in fact, if they don't have an opioid for 6 hours or something. So, I covered that and had an extraordinary overall, although there was definitely some critique to be had about my own experience and how it was facilitated. Wrote about that experience for Vice. But then, someone that was there, at the clinic with me, who arrived on my penultimate day, American chap, he died there. So, I didn't get wind of it, because then when I was conducting my interviews with the people at the clinic afterwards, they obviously didn't tell me. And in fact, the doctor told me that he'd never had a death, which is obviously erroneous because he just had a death. And I wrote about it. Like, the Vice piece went out, it was very sympathetic about the whole thing, and that's fine. And then, once I found out about the death, I wrote about it for Rolling Stone, and that ruffled a lot of feathers in the psychedelic community, even though it was an eminently fair and balanced piece. And what do you expect? You invite a journalist, even one that's, aware of the, positive potential effects of psychedelics. But, I meet a chap and then he dies there. Like, do people expect I'm not going to write about it? So that's the bargain people get into when they're seeking kind of media attention, right, for their ventures.
No, I agree totally. Just prior to this, I'm just working on my YouTube channel, and I just created my built a cannabis grifters channel, because it's about time. They've got so much ego, they never take stuff down that the rubbish they spoke about 7 or 8 years ago before they got banged up, or the SEC got them. I think it's really, really important, and America is a great place. The US is a great place where people love to reinvent themselves and create a world, but for some reason they think that there should be no critical thought applied to the way that they act. And there's a lot of people in there who, as we both know, there's a lot of innocent people out there, and there's always the few people who know how to take advantage. And just because it's psychedelics or it's cannabis or it's ibogaine or it's ayahuasca, doesn't give them a free pass to say that they can just get on and do what they do, because in the end, those people are normally, their main addiction is money. It isn't the things that they're talking about. And this is an issue that is becoming increasingly obvious to me,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
really important to talk about.
absolutely. There's a huge amount of exceptionalism in the space, cannabis and psychedelics. I do think that, with cannabis, I think the whole sort of bunker mentality is wearing off a bit, whereas it's still there in psychedelics. It's like, these drugs were unfairly maligned for decades. So, let's talk about the positives exclusively and not the issues, because we don't want to derail the whole thing. But if that's your ethos, and if that's kind of the standard you're holding everyone to, then you're just building your sort of house on sand,
Well, exactly. And
right?
look, we're both English, and we grew up with English literature, and I always have to send people back to Huxley, uh, you know, and Ballard and people like this who have already thought about this and warned us. And I love these people because they also have a classical education, and so they can explain an issue very clearly. And I think we're being very fuzzy in the 21st century, and fiction writers, novelists have already warned us about these people and what they can do with these compounds. And we are choosing, most are choosing to ignore those warning signals from 80, 90, 100 years ago. And I think it's really, really important to keep banging on about that.
Yeah, I mean, Jules Evans and Joseph Adams did this very, very interesting um, paper, journal article that got published last year on basically the inevitability within psychedelic communities and organizations of, the emergence of sort of guru dynamics for various reasons. But, on the face of it, like organizations, companies, corporations are, self-preservation oriented organizations, whether you're with psychedelics or not. When you set up a company and you've got employees to pay, the very nature of it is that you're going to obscure bad news, or indeed completely hide it, and exaggerate and elevate good news. And then when you add psychedelics to the mix, which makes people kind of hyper suggestible and kind of perhaps, even with the power of psychedelics to allow people to see through the looking glass, taken in the wrong sort of setting, and with alarming regularity, which is partly why I don't get high all the time. People start to think that their shit smells of roses, and as I say, that they're on some sort of messianic trip. And this is happening all across the board. So it's great fodder for me, and at the same
Well, I
time,
was
I'm
about to say, I
interested
mean,
in
yeah, we're this is a great first conversation for the podcast in 2026, because for me, one of the main discussions this year is, as we move into AI sort of working properly, although just tried to employ ChatGPT to do something very simple yesterday. It was completely useless. But beside that, is that coming together of this sort of growing psychedelic community, but also an, a desire in Washington, in certain parts of the administration, to allow large corporations to access psychedelics and develop products from psychedelics, led by by the health ministry department. What are you going to start writing more about, this sort of connection between technology and psychedelics?
Well, I think that's the peace of mind that attracted your attention. For The Guardian, I think they put out on Boxing Day
Yeah.
about this kind of rightward shift, at least in the people that are dominating the conversation around psychedelics and psychedelic reform and culture. The effervescence of irrationality as Justin Smith-Roy reported for GQ recently has really been co-opted by the right. And there's some interesting reasons behind that. I mean, the Christian right, have always been kind of loud and proud and evangelical about their cause, throughout history. And often that has had pretty disastrous consequences for the world, and indeed, the diluting of the sort of fundamental aspects and wisdom of Christianity and, the teachings of Jesus. And I do identify, not as a devout Christian, but, I guess a sort of spiritual Christian. So, I'm not coming at this from a sort of atheist perspective, but it's not difficult to kind of, see the issues here, of this kind of counterculture where, the Christian right are kind of at the wheel. But, with Trump in the White House and RFK as health secretary, they're in a position of extraordinary power here, and it does seem that, the left, and, I identify as, certainly more of a leftist than a rightist or a conservative, but, the right are seemingly taking more risks because they have more power in society and culture, at least in part. And yeah, I think it's a very, rich stream for me. I did a piece last month for the MAPS bulletin, or in November rather, sort of really analysing where the policy's going. But yeah, I'm not really sort of policy guy. I'm more of a kind of culture guy. So, let's see where this thing goes. But yeah, as Trump enters his kind of second calendar year, I believe, I mean, it's a really interesting time. And, at the same time, he's bloody using, these kind of fisherman boats that may or may not be, transporting a relatively small amount of cocaine to the US to kind of declare war.
Well, there's
clearly a proxy. It's clearly a proxy, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a faux drug war to the endless oil war. So I mean, that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
that we can have.
It's a whole other conversation, but it's like the drug war has always been used as this pretext, right? Whether it's like the alleged smell of cannabis in someone's car, and it's actually sort of more kind of, let's say, right-wing oriented people that are more prone to sort of using these drug war pretexts to sort of further their own
aims.
Designs.
Aims and designs. Look, we haven't got long to go, and I'd love to have another conversation entirely about this, but because I think it's one of the big stories of the next 5 years is as these sorts of compounds enter society and how that's managed. I'm more on the policy side, and that's what I'm trying to talk about. But let's talk about culture and good stuff to finish off. What do you see that's really positive about psychedelics and current North American culture? Do you you're sort of more immersed in it than me now. Do you see a flowering in any particular area that people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, at least in part, with the emergence of the Christian right as sort of psychedelic power players, in some ways, I don't think that's a bad thing, because it's almost like, thank God, the grown-ups are in charge. Because, these psychedelic communities that are dotted around North America are being led by kind of, I guess, more progressively, informed people, but often complete fools that have got zero sort of training for their neo-shamanic endeavors. And, a lot of them would probably benefit from just going off to the jungle and doing a 10-year apprenticeship with an actual shaman. Like you were saying, people would just reinvent themselves, kind of.
Well, it's the American story, reinventing itself. It's, that's why we've got whoever we've got in the White House at the moment, because he's the classic American story. I mean, that family is the American narrative of reinvention. Nobody ever really talks about that, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I I don't begrudge people sort of faking it until they make it. You know, as I outlined earlier, I've gone for a pretty traditional path to journalism. You know, this didn't happen overnight. I was doing student journalism. I was an editor at a student paper, and then did a master's, and you know, written for Vice for 11 years, and then I was kind of live blogging coronavirus updates for The Guardian for some time during the pandemic. So I've earned my stripes, I would say. But to your question, what am I excited about? I mean, sort of on a policy level, obviously I do think that medicalizing psychedelics and sort of decriminalizing more broadly is obviously a good idea, and is a huge improvement on the current slate of drugs that are available for people with psychiatric issues. I guess apart from that, which is a rather stock response, the use of psychedelics for creative problem solving, I do think is fascinating, and for potential scientific breakthroughs.
At which point our conversation came to a rather abrupt ending due to the standard Zoom warning of unstable internet connection. But Matt and I spoke for a couple of minutes more, and he's going to join us throughout the year for more updates like this on sort of culture, law, business, and psychedelics, etc., how he sees it from a bit more of a critical viewpoint than you might read in a lot of other outlets in the US. And it's also useful to get sort of an outlook that's not North American based as well. So thanks again to Mattha for joining us on the Karma Koala podcast, the first one of 2026, and look forward to speaking to him as the year progresses.
Live and direct, live and a date no jive.
Legalize it. So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."